In June 1812, the largest army Europe had ever seen crossed a river into Russia. Over 600,000 men, cavalry, artillery, supply wagons stretching for miles. The most feared military commander in the world led them. 6 months later, fewer than 100,000 came back. This is the story of how Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who conquered nearly all of continental Europe, destroyed his own empire with a single, catastrophic decision. By 1810, Napoleon controlled more of Europe than any ruler since Charlemagne. France, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, much of Germany, all under his direct rule or influence. Kings across the continent answered to him. He had rewritten the map of Europe through sheer military genius, winning battle after battle. Austerlitz, Jena, Friedland, he seemed unbeatable. But one power still resisted him: Britain. And to strangle Britain economically, Napoleon had created something called the Continental System, a blockade that forbade European nations from trading with the British. There was just one problem: Russia. Tsar Alexander I had reluctantly agreed to join the blockade, but by 1810, Russia quietly began trading with Britain again. Its economy was suffering, and grain exports to England were too valuable to give up. Napoleon saw this as betrayal, and Napoleon did not tolerate betrayal. So Napoleon made his choice. He would invade Russia, crush its army, and force the Tsar back into line. His advisors were uneasy. Russia was enormous. Its distances alone had swallowed invading armies before. But Napoleon believed he could do what no one else could: win fast, force a decisive battle, and end the war in weeks. He assembled the Grande Armée, the largest fighting force in European history to that point. Estimates range from 450,000 to over 600,000 men, drawn not just from France but from Poland, Germany, Italy, Austria, and beyond. It was less a French army than a coalition of the entire continent, marching under one man's ambition. In June 1812, they crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. This was the mistake, not just the invasion itself, but everything Napoleon assumed about it. Here's the strange part. The Russians didn't need a brilliant strategy to beat Napoleon. They barely needed a strategy at all. Russian generals, led by Mikhail Kutuzov, realized they couldn't win a head-on battle against Napoleon's superior army. So they simply retreated, again and again. They pulled back deeper into Russian territory, burning crops, villages, and supplies as they went, leaving nothing behind for the French to loot or live off of. This is often called a scorched earth strategy, though historians debate how deliberate it truly was versus simply the chaos of retreat. Either way, the effect was the same. Napoleon's army, which depended on living off captured land the way it had in every previous campaign, found nothing to eat. The Grande Armée began starving before it ever fought a major battle. Meanwhile, the distances were brutal. Unlike the tightly packed nations of Western Europe, Russia was vast. Soldiers marched for weeks without any decisive engagement. Heat, disease, and exhaustion began killing men long before winter ever arrived. By the time Napoleon reached Smolensk in August, he had already lost roughly a third of his army, and he hadn't fought a single major battle yet. Finally, near Moscow, the Russians turned to fight. On September 7, 1812, the two armies clashed at Borodino, one of the bloodiest single-day battles in human history. Somewhere between 70,000 and 80,000 men were killed or wounded in a single day. Napoleon technically won. The Russians withdrew. The road to Moscow was open, but it was a hollow victory. He hadn't destroyed the Russian army, just bloodied it. And he had lost tens of thousands of his own irreplaceable veteran soldiers this deep into hostile territory, with no way to resupply them. A week later, Napoleon marched into Moscow, expecting the Tsar to surrender. Instead, he found the city empty. And that night, it began to burn. Historians still debate who set the fires: Russian saboteurs, retreating soldiers, or accident. But the result didn't matter. Most of Moscow burned to the ground. There was no food, no shelter, no population left to negotiate with, and no Tsar willing to surrender. Napoleon waited. 5 weeks. He kept expecting Alexander to sue for peace. The Tsar never did. And that hesitation, that refusal to accept what was actually happening, was the second half of the mistake. Napoleon had bet everything on a quick, decisive war. When that plan failed, he had no backup plan. He simply waited in a burned-out city as autumn turned to winter. By the time he finally ordered a retreat in late October, it was already too late. What followed is one of the most catastrophic military disasters in history. The Grande Armée retreated along a route already stripped bare by their own advance months earlier. There was nothing left to eat. Then came the Russian winter, temperatures plunging far below freezing. Men froze to death standing up. Horses died by the thousands, which meant artillery and supply wagons had to be abandoned. Cossack cavalry harassed the retreating columns constantly, picking off stragglers. The crossing of the Berezina River in late November became a symbol of the entire catastrophe. French engineers built makeshift bridges under fire, while tens of thousands of soldiers and camp followers tried to cross before Russian forces closed in. Thousands drowned or were crushed in the panic. By December, when the remnants of the Grande Armée finally stumbled out of Russia, the numbers were almost unbelievable. Of the roughly 600,000 men who had crossed the Niemen in June, historians estimate only 100,000 or fewer made it back, and many of those were in no condition to fight again. Napoleon himself had abandoned the army in early December, rushing back to Paris amid rumors of a coup attempt. He left his marshals to manage what remained of the retreat. The Russian campaign didn't just cost Napoleon an army, it shattered the illusion of his invincibility. For over a decade, Napoleon's reputation had rested on the belief that he simply could not be beaten. Every European power that had opposed him, Austria, Prussia, Russia, Britain, Sweden, now saw proof otherwise. Within months, a new coalition formed against him, emboldened by what happened in Russia. France no longer had the veteran soldiers to replace its losses. The men who died in the snow weren't just numbers. They were the experienced core of Napoleon's entire military machine, irreplaceable in both skill and morale. In 1813, the coalition defeated Napoleon at the Battle of Leipzig. In 1814, Paris itself fell, and Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to Elba. Though he would return for one final campaign in 1815, ending at Waterloo, historians widely regard the Russian invasion as the moment the empire's fate was truly sealed. So, what was the actual mistake? It wasn't just invading Russia. It was a series of assumptions layered on top of each other, that Russia would fight the kind of fast, decisive battle Napoleon always won, that the vast Russian countryside would feed his army the way conquered territories always had before, that capturing the capital would force surrender. And when none of that held true, the deeper mistake was refusing to adapt, waiting in a burning city for a surrender that was never coming while winter closed in. Napoleon had built an empire on the belief that willpower and superior tactics could overcome any obstacle. Russia was the place that proved otherwise, not through a brilliant victory, but simply by being too big, too empty, and too cold to conquer on anyone's timeline but its own. One decision, 600,000 men, and an empire that never fully recovered.